Jim Banks had served 6 years in the Navy Reserve. He mentioned it in every speech, every interview, every campaign ad. Lieutenant Commander. JAG officer. Deployed to Afghanistan for 7 months in 2014. When he spoke about military policy on the House floor, he wore his service like armor, something that could not be questioned, could not be challenged, could not be penetrated by anyone who had not worn the uniform. By March 2025, he was no longer just a congressman from Indiana. He was a Senate candidate, leading in the polls by double digits, being discussed on cable news as a future leader of the Republican Party. Young, articulate veteran credentials, and a voting record that positioned him as tough on defense without being reckless. He was exactly what Republican strategists had been trying to manufacture for a decade. The Armed Services Committee hearing was supposed to be routine. The topic was oversight of defense contractor billing practices, dry, technical, the kind of hearing that normally attracted minimal attention. Banks was not even a member of the Armed Services Committee, but he had requested time to question witnesses as part of a joint session, citing his military background as justification. The chairman had allowed it. It was a courtesy extended to veterans in Congress, a recognition that their service gave them credibility on these matters. Jasmine Crockett sat 3 seats to his left. She had been assigned to Armed Services in her second term, a rare appointment for a sophomore representative, and one that had surprised political observers who assumed she would focus on civil rights or judiciary work. She had been quiet through the first 90 minutes of testimony, taking notes in the same slim portfolio she carried to every hearing, asking no questions, her expression neutral. Banks had used his opening question time to deliver what was functionally a speech. He spoke about waste in defense spending, about contractors overcharging the Pentagon, about the need for accountability. His tone was firm, authoritative, and calibrated for the clip that would inevitably be shared by his campaign. He used the phrase, "when I was deployed," twice in 4 minutes. He referenced conversations he had allegedly had with enlisted personnel about supply chain failures. He positioned himself as the voice of the troops, the person in the room who actually understood what happened downrange versus what happened in Washington conference rooms. Then he made his mistake. The witness testifying was a former contracting officer from the Defense Logistics Agency, a woman named Sarah Chen who had spent 23 years in military procurement before retiring. She had submitted a 47-page report documenting systematic overbilling by a major defense contractor. Banks had listened to her testimony with visible impatience, and when his second round of questions came, he leaned forward with the posture of someone about to correct a student who had misunderstood the assignment. "Ms. Chen, I appreciate your service, I really do. But I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here about how military procurement actually works in theater. You're looking at these billing documents from an administrative perspective, which is fine for a desk job at DLA, but when you're actually deployed, when you're actually on the ground managing logistics under combat conditions, you understand that sometimes costs are higher because of operational realities that don't show up on a spreadsheet." Chen's face remained professionally neutral, but something tightened around her eyes. "Congressman, I was deployed to Iraq 3 times as a contracting officer. I managed procurement under combat conditions for a total of 31 months. With respect, I'm not looking at this from a desk job perspective. I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone who watched contractors charge the DoD $47 for a bag of washers that cost $2 at any hardware store, and I'm looking at documents that show it happened 14,000 times." Banks smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this response so he could deliver the line he had prepared. "I understand that's your perception, and I'm sure you did your best in your role. But there's a difference between administrative oversight and actual command experience. I'm not questioning your dedication. I'm questioning whether someone in a support position can fully understand the operational pressures that drive these decisions. It's not a criticism. It's just a reality that some of us who have led troops in combat have a perspective that's difficult to appreciate from a contracting office." The room went very still. Chen's face flushed, but she said nothing. She was a witness, bound by decorum, unable to respond to what had just been said without appearing defensive. Banks had calculated that. He had delivered the dismissal in the form of a compliment, wrapped condescension in the language of respect, and positioned himself as the authority whose experience was beyond question. From 3 seats down, Crockett's voice cut through the silence. It was not loud. It was barely above conversational volume. But in the sudden quiet of the hearing room, it carried perfectly. "Point of personal privilege, Mr. Chairman." The chairman looked up surprised. Personal privilege was rarely invoked in committee hearings. It was a parliamentary procedure reserved for moments when a member's rights, reputation, or integrity had been directly attacked. The chair recognizes Congresswoman Crockett. Crockett did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned her head toward Banks, and when she spoke, every word was articulated with the precision of someone who had spent 10 years in courtrooms where a single misplaced word could cost a client their freedom. Congressman Banks, you just told a woman who deployed to a combat zone 3 times that she doesn't understand operational pressures because she worked in a support position. You used the phrase, those of us who have led troops in combat. I want to make sure I heard you correctly before I respond. Did you just claim combat leadership experience? Banks's smile faltered. It was a tiny shift, barely perceptible, but the cameras caught it. I served in Afghanistan as a JAG officer. I was deployed in support of combat operations. That's not what I asked. Crockett's tone had not changed. I asked if you led troops in combat. Yes or no? I was part of a combat support mission. I worked directly with... Yes or no, Congressman? The silence that followed was different from the silence that had followed Banks's dismissal of Chen. That silence had been uncomfortable. This silence was dangerous. Banks's face had gone very still. His hands, which had been gesturing expansively during his questioning of Chen, were now flat on the table in front of him. I was a JAG officer. We don't lead combat patrols. But we provide essential legal support to those who... So no. Crockett's voice was quiet, but it had an edge now, something sharp beneath the calm. You did not lead troops in combat. You were stationed at Bagram Air Base for 7 months providing legal services. You never left the base perimeter. You never went outside the wire. You never led a patrol, never directed a tactical operation, never made a decision under fire. Is that accurate? Banks's jaw tightened. Congresswoman, I don't think my specific role is relevant to answer the question. 12 seconds of total silence. The press gallery had stopped typing. The other committee members were frozen. Chen, the witness who had just been dismissed, was staring at Crockett with an expression that was equal parts shock and something that looked like vindication. Banks finally spoke. His voice was quieter than it had been 30 seconds earlier. I was stationed at Bagram. That's correct. For 7 months. Yes. Providing legal services, JAG work, contract review, rules of engagement guidance, administrative law. Yes. You never left the base. Banks's face had gone red now, the color rising from his collar. That was not my assigned role. That's not what I asked. Crockett opened the portfolio in front of her. She did not look at Banks while she did it. She looked at the single sheet of paper she removed, her eyes scanning it as if confirming details she had already memorized. I have your DD-2 here, the official record of your military service. It's public record because you released it yourself during your first congressional campaign. Under duty assignments, it lists your location as Bagram Air Base, your MOS as 27A, Judge Advocate, and your duty description as Legal Services Support. Under combat zones, it lists Afghanistan. Under combat operations, it lists 0. Under awards and decorations, you received the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the NATO Medal, and the National Defense Service Medal. Standard for anyone who deployed. What you did not receive, Combat Action Badge, Bronze Star with V device. Any award that would indicate you participated in combat operations. Because you didn't. You were a lawyer on a secure base doing contract reviews. She set the paper down. So when you dismissed Ms. Chen's testimony by saying that those of you who led troops in combat have a perspective she can't understand, you were lying. You don't have that perspective either. You have the perspective of someone who spent 7 months in an air-conditioned legal office on the safest military base in Afghanistan. Which is fine. That's honorable service. But it is not combat leadership. And using it to dismiss a woman who actually deployed to forward operating bases in Iraq, who actually managed procurement under mortar fire, who actually knows what it's like to work outside the wire, that's not just dishonest, Congressman. It's stolen valor. The room erupted. Not in sound, but in energy. Every reporter was typing. Every committee member was leaning forward. The chairman was gripping his gavel, but not using it as if he understood that intervening now would only make things worse for Banks. Banks's face had gone from red to white. I never claimed to have led combat patrols. I said I understood operational pressures. You said, and I quote, those of us who have led troops in combat have a perspective that's difficult to appreciate from a contracting office. You said it 4 minutes ago? It's on video. Would you like me to play it back? Banks said nothing. Crockett continued. Her voice was still quiet, but there was something beneath it now that had not been there before, something that sounded less like anger and more like exhaustion. Here's what operational pressure actually looks like, Congressman. Ms. Chen's report documents that she identified $340 million in fraudulent billing during her deployments. $340 million that contractors stole from the DoD by overcharging for basic supplies. She reported it up her chain of command. She documented every instance. She did it while living in a plywood hut in Balad, where mortars hit the perimeter 3 times a week. And when she came home and filed her whistleblower complaint, she was reassigned to a warehouse inventory position for 3 years until she retired. That's operational pressure. That's what it actually costs to tell the truth in a war zone. She turned to Chen, her expression softening for the first time. Ms. Chen, on behalf of this committee, I apologize that you had to sit here and listen to a congressman who never left Bagram imply that you don't understand what combat deployment is like. Your service was exemplary. Your report is credible. And anyone who actually read it instead of performing for cameras would know that. Chen's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Thank you, Congresswoman. Crockett turned back to Banks. You're running for Senate, Congressman. Your campaign website says you're a combat veteran who knows what it takes to lead under fire. That's a lie. You're a JAG officer who did 7 months on a secure base and then spent a decade pretending it was something more. Every veteran who actually saw combat, who actually led troops, who actually made life and death decisions under fire, you've been stealing their credibility for 12 years. And you just did it again to a woman who has more combat deployment time than you do because you thought she couldn't fight back. She closed her portfolio. The sound was soft but final. I'm done with my questions, Mr. Chairman. The hearing did not continue. Banks requested a recess. The chairman granted it. Banks left the room without looking at anyone, his face blank, his movements mechanical. He did not return after the recess. His office released a statement 2 hours later saying he had a scheduling conflict. By evening, every news outlet had the clip, not the full exchange. The 12-second silence after Crockett asked if he had led troops in combat. 12 seconds of a Senate frontrunner unable to answer the simplest possible question. 12 seconds that communicated everything anyone needed to know. By the next morning, 3 veterans organizations had rescinded their endorsements of his Senate campaign. By that afternoon, an opposition research firm had found 6 additional instances where Banks had implied or directly claimed combat leadership experience he did not have. By the end of the week, his polling numbers had dropped 8 points. He stayed in the race. He continued to campaign, but the clip followed him everywhere. At every town hall, at every debate, at every campaign stop, someone would ask about it. And every time he tried to explain, tried to clarify, tried to walk back what he had said, it only made it worse. Because the truth was simple and could not be spun. He had used service. He did not have to dismiss a woman who had done the job he had only pretended to do. 3 months later, he lost the primary. Not by a small margin. He lost by 19 points to a candidate who had never served in the military at all, but who had also never lied about it. Crockett never mentioned him again. She did not need to. The 12 seconds had done the work. 12 seconds that proved what she had been trying to tell people since the day she arrived in Congress. Credibility is not given by a uniform or a title or a campaign bio. Credibility is earned by telling the truth, especially when the truth is costly. Banks had spent 12 years building a reputation on service he had exaggerated. Crockett had destroyed it in 12 seconds by simply asking him to tell the truth. You tried to mansplain military policy to a woman who actually read the deployment records, she had said in a tweet later that night. The tweet had 17 million views. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about party. This was about a man who had stolen valor for a decade finally being asked to show his receipts. And when the moment came, when the simplest question was asked, he had nothing. 12 seconds. That was all it took. 12 seconds of silence that said everything 12 years of lies had tried to hide.